In 2026 alone, over 30,000 tech workers in the US have already lost their jobs. And we're only at the beginning of the year. For a lot of people, this isn't just a number. It's colleagues disappearing from Slack channels. It's unexpected calendar invites. It's teams getting smaller without explanation. This isn't one company cutting costs. Amazon has already laid off around 16,000 people. Dell reduced its workforce by about 11,000. Atlassian cut roughly 10% of its staff. And Meta is reportedly considering cuts of up to 15,000 jobs. This is happening across the entire industry. And when you zoom out, over 127,000 tech jobs were cut in 2025. That creates a kind of background noise people start to live with. Not panic exactly, but uncertainty. A sense that things aren't as stable as they used to be. This isn't a one-time wave. It's a pattern. So if you think layoffs are slowing down, they're not. And even if you haven't been directly affected yet, it's getting harder to ignore the possibility. The real question is, what happens next? But layoffs are only part of the story. What's happening underneath is actually more important. Because for most people, the concern isn't just losing a job, it's how hard it might be to find the next one. In the US, hiring has been quietly weakening for over 2 years. The number of job openings dropped to around 6.5 million in late 2025, the lowest level in 5 years. And even when openings tick up slightly, hiring itself remains slow and cautious. So companies aren't just laying people off. They're also hiring fewer people to replace them. That's where the pressure builds. Back in 2022, there were more than 2 job openings for every unemployed person. If you were looking, you had options. Today, that number is much closer to 1-to-1, which means for every open role, there's essentially another person competing for it. That shift doesn't always feel dramatic day to day, but it shows up in longer job searches, fewer responses, and more competition. In tech, the shift is even more visible. Job postings are still significantly below pre-pandemic levels. Entry-level hiring has dropped sharply, and companies are prioritizing fewer, more experienced hires. Even when companies are hiring, they're being extremely selective. For many professionals, that translates into a frustrating experience. More applications, more interviews, less certainty. 2025 wasn't just a year of layoffs. It was a year where hiring slowed, interviews got longer, and fewer offers were made. So even if you haven't been affected yet, the market around you already has. And that's usually where the feeling starts, not from losing a job, but from realizing how different the market has become. So what's actually driving this? Because this isn't random. This is a structural shift in how tech companies operate. Between 2020 and 2022, tech companies hired aggressively. Amazon nearly doubled its workforce. Meta and Google scaled rapidly to meet demand. At the time, it made sense. Demand was high. Digital products were growing fast. Everything pointed in one direction. But that demand didn't last. When growth slowed, companies were left overstaffed. So what we're seeing now is a correction. And corrections don't happen evenly. They tend to come in waves, which is why things can feel stable one moment and uncertain the next. At the same time, something else changed. For years, tech was driven by growth at all costs. But when money became more expensive, companies had to shift toward profitability. Investors started demanding efficiency, stronger margins, more output with fewer resources. And the fastest way to cut costs is headcount. That shift alone changes how secure roles feel. At the same time, AI is starting to change the equation, not by replacing entire jobs, but by reducing the amount of work needed to get results. Fewer junior roles, smaller teams, higher productivity expectations. So instead of hiring 10 people, companies are asking if they can do it with 6. And that question affects everyone, even those who are currently employed, because it changes how future hiring decisions are made. And there's one more shift most people miss. Companies are no longer just hiring general tech talent. They're hiring fewer people, but expecting them to understand specific industries. Software plus infrastructure, data plus real-world systems, cybersecurity plus critical networks. This is where the gap starts to appear, because most professionals were trained in one environment, but the demand is moving toward another. When you combine all of this, you don't just get layoffs. You get a completely different job market. And most people are still reacting to the old one, trying the same strategies, looking in the same places, expecting the same outcomes. but the rules have already changed. So at this point, most people can see something is off. Not necessarily in a dramatic way, but in small signals. Slower responses, more competition, less certainty about what comes next. But the way they're reacting is where the real problem starts. A lot of professionals still believe this is temporary, that things will go back to normal, that hiring will pick up again, and things will feel the way they used to. And that belief is understandable, because for years, the tech industry rewarded that mindset. But the data doesn't support it anymore. Hiring hasn't bounced back. Companies are still cutting costs. And the structure of jobs is already changing. This isn't a dip, it's a reset. And resets don't reverse overnight. The second reaction is more passive. I'll just wait. Things will stabilize. And on the surface, that feels reasonable. But what usually happens is different. By the time it feels urgent, you're already behind. Because while some people wait, others are already adjusting, exploring adjacent roles, understanding where demand is moving, quietly preparing for change. The third mistake is thinking, I just need more skills. So people start taking courses, adding certifications, trying to stay competitive. But more skills don't automatically make you safer. Relevant skills do. Skills that match where demand is actually going. Right now, the gap isn't as big as people think. It's usually one domain shift, one certification, one repositioning of your experience. But without direction, it's easy to invest time in the wrong things. The real misunderstanding is this. Most people are still thinking in terms of their current industry, their current role, their current path. But the market isn't organized that way anymore. Skills are moving across industries. Demand is shifting, and opportunities are showing up in places most people aren't even looking. So the issue isn't that opportunities don't exist. It's that most people are looking in the same place, while the market is quietly moving somewhere else. And if you follow where the demand is actually going, a very different picture starts to emerge. So if this isn't temporary, where is all of this actually going? Because jobs don't just disappear, they move. And that movement isn't always obvious at first. It happens gradually, until suddenly it feels like everything has shifted. The first change is already happening. Companies are hiring fewer people, but expecting more from each one. Not just technical execution, but understanding, context, the ability to connect systems, not just build them. That changes what being qualified actually means. It's no longer just about coding or tools or frameworks. It's about where those skills are applied. At the same time, demand isn't disappearing. It's shifting into industries that are still growing. Infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, critical systems. These sectors don't get as much attention. They're not discussed the same way as tech. They don't dominate headlines. But they are expanding, quietly, consistently. And for someone inside tech, that shift can feel invisible, because it's happening outside of their immediate environment. And here's the part most people miss. There's a growing mismatch. Companies in these industries need tech skills. They need people who understand systems, data, automation, security. But tech professionals aren't looking there, not because they can't do the work, but because they don't see themselves in those roles. There's a perception gap. Right now, your skills are more transferable than ever. But that only matters if you recognize where they apply. Because the same skills, in a different context, can open completely different opportunities. So what we're seeing isn't the disappearance of opportunity. It's a redistribution from where everyone is looking to where very few people are. And once you start seeing that shift, you can't really unsee it. And one of those areas is already pulling in tech talent faster than most people realize. So where is this shift actually happening? One of the clearest signals right now is in the energy sector. And for a lot of people, that comes as a surprise. Because energy isn't usually part of the tech conversation. It's not where people instinctively look. This isn't about trends. It's about necessity. Energy infrastructure is being rebuilt, driven by electrification, grid modernization, renewable expansion, and growing data center demand. And that scale creates pressure, because all of this requires technology, software systems, data platforms, automation, security. And here's where it gets interesting. Energy companies don't have enough people with technical backgrounds. They've historically hired within their own industry, but that's no longer enough. So they're actively trying to hire from outside, especially from tech. And this is where the overlap becomes clear. A lot of the skills are already the same. Software systems, data analysis, cybersecurity, systems thinking, but most professionals never explore this path. Not because they're not qualified, but because they've never been shown how their experience translates. And when something feels unfamiliar, it's easy to ignore it. Energy doesn't look like tech. It's not as polished. It's not as visible. It doesn't carry the same identity, but it is growing, and it is understaffed. And that creates a very specific kind of opportunity, the kind that isn't obvious until you start looking in the right place. So while most people are competing for fewer roles in tech, there's an entire category of jobs where demand is moving in the opposite direction. And the gap between those two worlds is smaller than most people think. If you're in tech right now, you don't need to make a decision today, and you don't need to assume the worst. But it's hard to ignore the shift that's happening. And for a lot of people, the uncertainty comes from one simple question: what are my actual options? Because it's one thing to hear that industries are changing. It's another to understand where you personally fit into that change. Most professionals are closer than they think, but without a clear map, it's difficult to see that. So we have built something simple, a free, super focused tool that maps your current skills to roles where demand is actually growing. It takes just a couple of minutes, and it gives you a clearer picture of where your skills already apply, what roles are realistic for you, and what your next step could look like. No pressure to act, no need to commit to anything, just clarity, because the people who understand their options early tend to make better decisions over time. If you want to check it out, you'll find it in the description below.